Okay. Nope. Everything just can't get to where I want to be. There we go. All right. Go back to the beginning. Okay. Well, this is going to be, some of this is going to be a little,
Your audio went out, Eric.
there we go. There I'm back. Sorry. So anyway, uh yeah, Romans 9 to 11 are certainly chapters are sometimes neglected in the book of Romans. Sometimes when people read Romans, they think about justification by faith. They have the little thing they're interested in, or some little verse that's here and there, or creation in Romans 1, whatever. But just like any other letter in the Bible, you have to read it, read the whole thing in context. It's good to try to read Paul's letters in one sitting if you can do it. If you can just read the whole letter all the way through, like he's writing a letter, if you can just read it instead of maybe reading like two chapters, saying that's enough for today. Just try to read it as one letter the whole way through. Anyway, okay. So having said that, let's dive in here. Now, we're going to get into some of the issues with the history of the church with Israel. Obviously, there's been a lot of different views. Well, not a ton of different views, but there's always been issues of what we call replacement theology, what we call supersessionism, which I will talk about more and define. But if you want to learn a little more about this, these are two really good resources. Just remember, when you read the Bible, how you view Israel in the Bible is going to impact how you view how you read the Bible, right? How you read the text. Okay, so if you don't take that in consideration, then you're going to be missing a lot of what the Bible's teaching. Of course, also about what Paul's teaching, no doubt about it. Okay, so these are two really good books if you want to just go a little deeper. There's a term that I talked about Michael Brown with when he was last on the call a couple years ago on we talked about anti-Semitism, but sometimes people don't call it replacement theology; they call it supersessionism, and that's a word that comes from a couple Latin words: super, honor, upon, or sedere, to sit. Um, it just means one like person sitting on someone's other chair, displacing the latter. Okay, so um, just like in religion, like when you think of people that study world religions, or you run into people, you're witnessing to Muslims, you're witnessing to Mormons, they always say, well, the previous revelation's been corrupted and God needed to bring a newer revelation to correct the old one, and we need a new revelation. That's why we have the Book of Mormon, and we have Islam that comes along, because the previous revelation had been corrupted. So they're saying their revelation supersedes the previous one. Okay? So the previous revelations given by Jesus and the apostles and written down in the New Testament has been corrupted according to them, and we need a new revelation, one that supersedes that one. Of course, I don't agree with that at all, and most people on this call don't think there's any new revelation coming after the time of Jesus and the apostles, but that's how cults get started, and that's why we have conversations with these people. That's what they believe. Sometimes theologians they won't use the phrase replacement theology more. Sometimes they call it fulfillment theology, or instead of supersessionism, sometimes they say, well, Jesus fulfills everything that Israel was and is. Okay, everything about Israel has been fulfilled in the person of Jesus. They might say Jesus fulfills the sacrificial system, which he does. Jesus fulfills the Levitical priesthood, which he does. He fulfills the priesthood. Or Jesus fulfills uh, the means of atonement Israel had, which he does. But they sometimes tend to go a little extreme. Everything about Israel's history gets fulfilled in Jesus. The land, the people, everything gets fulfilled, kind of wrapped up in Jesus, okay? Or just kind of, Jesus just absorbs everything, okay? And that's kind of like more of a extreme view, but that's kind of where some of this goes in that direction. Um, Sometimes in the history of replacement theology, or what we call supersessionism, um, Christians have said throughout history, whether it be theologians or scholars or pastors or just Christian teachers and leaders, they might say, like, there's no future restoration of Israel. They might say, Israel's kind of what we call a type in the Old Testament. They're a picture of what the church will be one day. And so the church, or what we call the ecclesia, that's what we are, the ecclesia, the people of God. We are now the true Israel, the new Israel. Okay. Or they might say, like, the land of Israel has no purpose in the plan of God. The land promises to Israel and Abraham have come and been universalized, include the entire world. Or they might say, well, the Jews rejected Jesus. They rejected him when they came, and they're responsible for his execution. They didn't heed the warning of the prophets, so God judged Israel with destruction of the temple, and God's kind of divorced Israel. That's kind of the view some people have as well. So a lot of these things need better. I mean, they certainly can be explained in greater detail. There's a lot that goes into this. That's why I recommend these books back here if you want to go deeper on the topic. But these are some of the things that come out. Justin Martyr was one of the first Christian apologists we had in the years 100 to 165. And he was really the first Christian writer to actually say the church is Israel, as far as explicitly identify the church as Israel. He said, for the true spiritual Israel and descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, we are all been led to God through the crucified Christ. So, um, the church is really the true, Israel. So this became more prominent in other Christian writings throughout the second, third century, fourth century. I mean, just Christian, church fathers, other people just coming out and really, saying the church really is the new Israel. Some of them might think there's a future restoration of Israel in the future, but they still think the church is Israel now. Some of them believe maybe in a future conversion of the Jews, like in the end of Romans 11, that we'll talk about today. But they did come out, and a lot of times Christianity over history ended up becoming a reaction to Judaism. It really became like a reaction, like more Gentiles came to faith as the faith spread out of Jerusalem throughout the world. A lot of the Jews who believed in Jesus kind of became a smaller minority. And of course, the church today is predominantly Gentile based, right? It's not it doesn't have like a Jewish entity anymore. There's Jews who believe today. Obviously, they're still there, but they're not the majority as they started out in the beginning of the first century. In the beginning, when the community started, it was all Jews, and it was weird for a Gentile to believe, right? It was very odd. I mean, they didn't know what to do with Gentiles, right? Cornelius was the first Gentile who believed in Acts 10. We know we read in Acts 15 where they have that Jerusalem council and they don't know what to do with the Gentiles, and the apostles have to figure out what to do. But then as time goes on, throughout history and geography, and just geographically how the faith spread throughout other nations, the church eventually became an entity outside of its starting point. Now, today, of course, most people believe we have like two separate religions. We have Judaism, Christianity, and they don't have any relationship with each other anymore, right? That's a result of several historical, sociological, and geographical factors that a lot's been written on that, but that's a long story in itself. Um, but anyway, um, sometimes when you read the Old Testament, um, we see sometimes where most of the prophets all thought that salvation is not just the Jews didn't believe in the Old Testament like salvation is just getting to heaven. They didn't have that concept in their thinking. Okay, that's something came along much later. Okay, they viewed as the kingdom of God as really like Israel having a kingdom on earth. Jesus is the Messiah is ruling here now on earth. And there's the land's at peace, Israel's at peace, the nations are at peace. And then of course the church kind of reacts to that, comes along later and says, no, the church is a true Israel, and the national physical land promises are now spiritually fulfilled in Jesus and the church, and not the nation of Israel. So any kind of future restoration for Israel is in the past. Okay, that doesn't really, Jesus got rid of that thinking, and it's all gone now. Okay. Um, there's some Christians that believe this still, certainly theologians, scholars, some don't. Depends what your theological training is. It depends the way you're taught to read the scriptures. It depends on a lot of things. Okay. If you go to seminary, that just everybody reads a certain tradition or denominational heritage into the Bible. They just do. If you go to Lutheran seminary, Methodist seminary, Baptist seminary, Reformed seminary, whatever it is, you read that grid into the Bible. Okay, that can be challenging because the biblical authors don't have those viewpoints. The biblical authors are not Methodist, Lutheran, Baptist, Catholic, Presbyterian, evangelical, whatever word you want to use. They don't have that mindset. They're not dealing with Christian denominations and dealing with what Christianity's become today for centuries and centuries later of denominationalism. They just don't have that background. Okay, they're living in the Middle East, different culture, different language, different people. It's not that all those things are bad. People, it's look, you know what you know. That's all you know. You're raised in a certain denomination. That's all you know, and that's what you learn. It's not like sin. I'm just saying that's just the way it is today. I mean, we're the result of church history. We are where we are. So it doesn't mean to condemn. I'm not trying to condemn anybody. I'm just saying the biblical authors don't have those viewpoints necessarily. Um, anyways, now sometimes definitely, definitely sometimes theologians read the Bible through the grid of the Palestinian-Israel conflict. It's been going on forever. Um, it's just the way it is. And I personally, like I said, I came back from Israel. I certainly have just as strong as a burden for Palestinians to come to faith that I do the unbelieving Jews there. And I don't want to see any Palestinians suffer. They are suffering because they don't have any leadership. But that's a long history of what's happened, in the history of Israel and the whole thing with the Palestinian-Israel conflict. I think I did a Zoom call on Justin Crone's Hope in the Holy Land. I think it's called Hope in the Holy Land documentary, which I recommend some of you watch. I think some of you have watched it since I had Justin on last year. I think I had him on last year or year before. I don't remember, but Hope in the Holy Land is an excellent documentary talking about that issue. I don't have time to go into that. Sometimes when you hear the word like Zionist, some Jews are Zionists for sure. Some Jews are not Zionists. Some Christians are Zionists. Some Christians are not Zionists. It just depends on who you talk to. But it comes from the word Zion. Obviously it's used in the Bible several times. Is a term used by the psalmist during the Babylonian exile when they're longing to remember their homeland. It kind of became more of a modern term for Jewish people to return to Jerusalem or it's Israel. I mean, it has to do with Jews having a homeland, of course, right? A safe place to live. Sometimes it's viewed in a secular political lens. Some religious Jews don't like it. Some Jewish people definitely do like it. Some Jewish people don't care. Some Christians don't care. Some Christians are definitely very Zionist. Okay. It just depends on who you talk to. Okay. But um, some obviously want Israel to continue as a Jewish state and prosper. Um, some don't want Israel to exist. Some want the Palestinians to have everything. Some want a two-state solution. They want Jews and the Palestinians to live in peace. They want a two-state solution. They still haven't figured out how to do that to this day, as we know. That has to do with a long, messy history, a lot of politics, a lot of practical issues. I don't have time to go into that. You can watch Justin's documentary, as I mentioned. Um, there's theological issues when you study this issue in the Bible. But now that I've been to Israel, I mean, I knew this before I went to Israel. We need to remember that when you read the Bible, okay, about Israel in the Bible, you don't want to just view Israel as like a future thing. Like, oh, God will deal with Israel in the future one day. It's all in the future. It's true that there is a future there that the Bible talks about. It talks about the nations in the future as well. But we need to remember these are people living in the land now. These are real Jews living in the land. There's a real land. God's at work there. He's at work among the Palestinians too. But we just need to stop always thinking like, oh, I don't care about what happens today. Israel's a secular state and they're not living under obedience to God and they're rejecting their Messiah. And, so who cares? You know what I mean? That's just in the future, God will deal with Israel. And we just need to focus on the church. Well, that's fine and dandy, but once you're in Israel living there, you realize that it does matter, what's going on in the here and now in the land. Okay. And that this impacts people's lives. Okay. Now, just a reminder of the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis. That I don't know why God picked a land to dwell in. I don't know why he picked a fallen people group to work with. I have no idea. I'm not smart enough to figure that out. That's why I'm not God. But for some reason, he called out Abraham and he decided to form a nation and he decided to dwell in the land and he gave them, land to possess. They didn't possess it completely, as we know. To this day, they haven't. And he talks about blessings will come to Abraham and his future descendants, of course. Okay. There's a big debate in Christian theology today whether the Abrahamic covenant has any future for the Jewish people. I understand. I know all the views. I've seen all the debates. I don't want to talk about all those tonight necessarily. But Gentiles are mentioned in the Abrahamic covenant because we come through the seed of Abraham. And of course, Gentiles are grafted in as well, as Paul talks about in Romans 11. But there's been a lot of exiles in Israel's history long before they're still in exile, by the way, to this day. They're living all across the world today. There was an exile took place way back in the time of Joseph, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons. And of course, that first return took place at the Exodus, when God brought people out of Egypt, brought them back, right, with Moses. Then you had a second exile that took place in two phases. In the initial phase, it came in the time of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel in 720 BC into the Syrian Empire, prophesied by Jonah and Amos, plus Hosea later and executed in Second Kings. Then, of course, you read about Nehemiah and others talking about the return and building the temple and all those things. We have the second return that took place at the end of 70-year captivity, with Cyrus. Of course, God raised up Cyrus, someone who wasn't, as far as we know, a believer. But anyway, God raised him up. And then you had another exile, and then you have this talk of another gathering, return, where Isaiah talks about a remnant that will return. There's talks about, I think, what we see over history. The gathering regathering happens over, just progressively. I want to say, it just happens progressively. It's not like a one-time event. Okay, where Jews go back to the land. I don't think that Christians need to be trying to. Some Christians believe they need to expedite the return of Jesus by getting all the Jews back to the land. Let's fly the Jews back to the land. I mean, that I don't think that's really what we need to be doing. God will do what he's going to do. So then we had the Holocaust, which was, by the way, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Israel. It was nothing you could walk through without walking through in tears at some point when you see all the as I said to one of my friends on the tour, I looked at him and said, this really shows the depravity of man, shows how depraved man can be to do something like this. So after the war, Israel was given a homeland again. Now, remember, it's not like Israel never was in the land. Okay, it's not like, well, that's the first time they ever got their land. No, 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 that's false. Okay, Jews were in the land before 1948. Okay, but the point is that they were given this independence, at least, after the war because obviously they believed that the Jews needed a homeland to go to. I mean, they were being scattered all over Europe after World War II, sometimes, in terrible situations. Some of them came to the US, as we know. But some Christians say that 1948, there's two views. One view has nothing to do with anything prophetic. It's strictly out. It comes out of the result of politics and pragmatic reasons. That through politics, Israel got this land. We know England had it. Harry Truman had just. There's all kinds of political reasons and pragmatic reasons. Nothing to do with prophecy. Other people see God's providential hand behind those political things, like His hand, His invisible hand, is behind all that, working behind the scenes. Okay. And then some people see it as direct prophecy being fulfilled. God will bring back the land. This is fulfillment of prophecy. Okay. Christians are divided on that topic. It just depends on who you talk to. It's all over the road, to be honest. But one way or the other, something happened with Israel in the land in 1948. We do know that happened. Okay. Um, like I said, there's some Christian writers who are very, very adamant about seeing that what's happened with the land in Israel has nothing to do with any kind of prophetic fulfillment or really anything to do with the Bible. They think that everything's been fulfilled in Jesus. They don't see any of those Old Testament prophecies as being about Israel anymore, about being restored to the land, or anything to do with the land, really. They're all those promises fulfilled in Jesus. Okay. And that's part of what we call supersessionism, replacement theology. Now, they won't like those terms. They don't like hearing that. But at the end of the day, if you pin them down, it's really all the same thing. Everything's fulfilled in Jesus. Okay. But I don't mean, listen, I got brothers or sisters all over the road. I got brothers and sisters all across denominational lines and theological lines that some believe certainly a future conversion of Israel. They believe Jews need the gospel, but they don't see any purpose for Israel now in the plan of God. I got others to the opposite extreme that totally believe Israel is certainly still involved in the plan of God. It just depends, who you talk to. But I said, last week when I was on the Mount of Olives, that this was talked about in the Bible, that Jesus descended or ascended in the Mount of Olives in Acts 1. And then, of course, Zechariah talks about this future figure will plant his feet on the Mount of Olives. Now, some Christians don't see those passages in Zechariah as being fulfilled in the future. They think they're just spiritual now and they're not really a physical, literal fulfillment because they read the Bible what we call right to left. They read the New Testament back into the Old Testament. They don't read left to right. Okay. Starting with the old, going up to the new. Okay. It just depends on their hermeneutics. All right. The way they read the Bible. But, in the biblical narrative, as I've said before, salvation isn't just going to heaven when we die. The final event or our final destination is the new heavens, new earth with a resurrection body, right? And that means the earth will be here, it'll be renewed. Jesus will be on earth, we'll be on earth with our resurrected bodies, and Jesus is not coming back to Chicago, and he's not coming back to LA, and he's not coming back to Miami, Florida, or Columbus, Ohio. He's coming back to Israel. That's where he'll be, as far as I can see scripturally. I don't know where else he's coming to. And Peter says in Acts 1, but this is my interlude into Romans 9 through 11. You guys are like, what does that have to do with Romans 9 through 11? You'll see. When he said to Peter in Acts 1, he said, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel now, Lord? This is after Jesus was resurrected. He still wants to know when Jesus is going to restore that kingdom. When's it going to happen? Are you going to bring that restored kingdom? And Peter and the apostles were living in the eschatological timeline that we are in right now, where the kingdom of God broke in. Jesus brought the kingdom, but it's not finished. It's still in the future, right? And so we're kind of in that middle point right here, as I've talked about this before, the already not yet phase, where Jesus came and he broke in here and he brought the kingdom. He started the kingdom, right? But it's not done yet. He'll bring this part over here, where the physical reign of Jesus will come into earth, and then he'll finish up and consummate everything, right? So we live in that tension right now, in that middle phase. We're right here. already, but not yet. We live as eschatological people, as I say. We live in this event that happened 2,000 years ago, but we live in the future, and we live in that tension in the middle. Okay. Um, so Peter, was looking to some of these things when he talks about you're going to restore Israel. The prophets, it talked about this restoration of the land. He, talked about the world was different. All these passages in the Old Testament had never come to pass. They never came to pass prophetically, still haven't to this day. And Peter is looking for those things. Okay, that's what he was looking for. And he said, "Are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel?" Um, all these passages. Okay, so that is something to think about. Whether we believe, in the future when Jesus brings a physical kingdom, whether these things will be fulfilled at that time. Okay, Christians debate on that. They debate on their eschatology. So the Holocaust played out, by the way, in Europe. By the way, one of the reasons for the Holocaust has to do with replacement theology. Okay, that led to some aspects of what happened in the Holocaust were led to bad theology. Okay, I'm not saying everybody today believes in replacement theology is anti-Semitic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not accusing anybody of that. I wouldn't do that. That's a huge claim. Just like if you say somebody's racist, you have to have really good evidence for that. But I'm saying though it did lead to the thinking, okay, the cause of the Holocaust, okay, because a lot of every Christian writer for the first 5 centuries after Jesus came were kind of in opposition to Judaism, or they said something really negative about Israel, or they viewed the Pharisees as being the worst people on the face of the earth, and they kind of lumped all the Jewish people in with the Pharisees, okay, so anyway. So always know, just to mention, you always want to know the history of anti-Semitism and the role it's played in the history of how Jews view Jesus. There's different forms of anti-Semitism. One form of anti-Semitism is certainly based on just hatred of the Jewish people because of their ethnicity. Like you just don't like Jews because you hate them because they're just ethnically Jewish, right? Or it could be viewed as anti-Zionism, that you think the Jewish people don't deserve any homeland at all. They don't deserve a homeland, period. All the Swiss get a homeland, the Germans get a homeland, the Chinese get a homeland, the US gets a homeland, Americans get a home, but the Jews don't get a homeland. Okay. Or theological anti-Semitism, meaning that you just are really critical of Jewish beliefs and practices. Okay. I'm not accusing anybody of anti-Semitism, saying throughout history, those are the kinds of anti-Semitism that have popped up. Okay. There's books on this. I talked to Michael Brown about this on my Zoom call. You can go back and watch it. It's on my YouTube channel. He wrote a book called Christian Anti-Semitism. He's got another book called Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. Really good books if you want to go deeper. Okay. So in Romans 9 through 11, there's about 73 references to Israel. Well, 73 references to Israel in the New Testament. I'm sorry. But of these, 70 clearly refer to ethnic Jews. Okay. Ethnic Jewish people. You'll see some of these. The ones that are debated the most are Romans 9:6, Romans 11:25 to 26, and Galatians 6:16. There's been so many debates over what Paul means in Galatians 6:16 is the Israel of God that I've given up. Because I mean, you could find people on all sides of the debate that know just as much as the other person does, that just don't agree, and read their theological presuppositions into the text, of course. But anyway, overall, most references refer to ethnic Jews. Okay. And you read kind of in Romans 9 through 11, you read about Paul talks about the gifts of Israel, the uniqueness of Israel, the calling of Israel, the confirmation of Israel's promises, and how God has not revoked Israel's election. Okay. So you start out with Romans 9. When you read that, if you read, I'm not going to go line by line. We don't have time. I'm not going to go like line by line through Romans 9 through 11. We're just going to do some highlights here. There's no way we could do that in 45 minutes. But Romans 9, 1 through 5, Paul is broken over his people's rejection, right? He even wishes he could be cut off or accursed, from Jesus. So his kinsmen would come to know their Messiah. He seems to have a credible burden, for the rejection that his people are having towards their Messiah. He talks about these 9 blessings. He says to my kinsmen, and he's writing in the present tense. He says they have the covenants, the temple service, the promises still belong to them. He mentions covenants in the plural. He doesn't say one covenant. Okay. So Paul is burdened, definitely burdened about his people's rejection. If Paul was saying that there's no role for Israel anymore, I don't know what Paul means in Romans 9 when he says, he says they're Israelites and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple service, and the promises. So that would be kind of odd for Paul to say that if nothing belongs to them anymore at all. And then I guess go back to that. But there is a verse in Romans 9:6 that sometimes people think that is expanded. The Israel means to include believing Gentiles. Um, I tend to view Romans 9:6 as teaching that this is talking about believing Jews. Those are Jews who believe as a subset within ethnic Israel. Um, Paul doesn't really, sometimes in churches you'll hear like there's spiritual Israel and fleshly Israel, and that spiritual Israel is a Christian church, but I don't think Paul really, that's reading a lot into the text. I don't really think that's what Paul is talking about. Um, a good picture of this is what the ecclesia, the church of what we are. We are what Paul's talking about Romans 9, I'm sorry. When he talks about Israel, you have the believing Israel, the Jewish remnant that believes today. Those are Jews who believe, like Messianic Jews, and every Jew who believes today, which I think I said last week there's about 30,000 Jews who believe in Israel right now, then more worldwide, like maybe up to 700, 800,000. I don't know the exact number. And then you have unbelieving Israel, the ethnic Israel that's an unbelief, right? That's the ethnic. He says Christ became a servant to the circumcision on behalf of truth of God to confirm the promises given to fathers and the Gentiles to glorify God for his mercy. Now, Paul's right that he says not all Israel. It means that true Israel need to be circumcised in the heart, right? They need to be circumcised in the not. It's not of the they need the Holy Spirit. They need to be saved. They need to be circumcised in the heart. Not all, though all are Abraham's children, not all Abraham's seed. And so, you have the children of promise that Paul talks about there. The point is that birthright isn't enough. Just being, Israel was elected in the Abrahamic covenant. They received their election to the Abrahamic covenant. They didn't, when they got the law, they're given the Torah, the law, like we talk about the law, or the better translations, Torah. That wasn't like a way to get salvation. They weren't given, Moses wasn't given that so he could walk around and tell the Israelites, well, if you keep one commandment, you're saved. If you don't keep a commandment, you're not saved. You need to keep 10 commandments so you're saved, or keep 13 commandments, you're not saved. There's 613 commandments, and if you keep 200 of them, you're saved. You don't keep 110 of them, you're not saved. That is not what's going on when God gives the law to Moses, which he gives to the people. They are already the elect people of God through the Abrahamic covenant. They were elected and they received that election through the Abrahamic covenant. The Torah, the gave me law, is more about Israel's sanctification, how they live as holy people, right? How they're set apart and live as holy people. They came out of Egypt. They had a lot of idolatry and a lot of sin issues there, and God was teaching them how to live. Now, but what Paul does in Romans 9 is he talks about that election isn't going to be enough. You can't really rely just on being elected through the Abrahamic covenant. Okay. Just like Jesus says to the Jews in John 8, when he's chastising the Jewish leaders, they say, we're descendants of Abraham. And he says, no, no, no. Now you need to believe in me. Like, if you don't believe I am he, you'll die in your sins. Relying on your descent from Abraham isn't going to be good enough now. Now I've come. I'm the Messiah. You need to believe in me. Okay. I'm the way. All right. So what Paul's saying is the only those related to God both physically and spiritually are the true Israel, right? Physical descent isn't enough. Um, he's talking about, there's an Israel who is according to the flesh, and who are Abraham's descendants, and those descendants according to the seed. Okay, so I know this is a little, this gets a little very theological, but you have, like, he's talking about the nation of Israel is composed of two parts: the elect remnant and the rest who are hardened, who have stumbled. The nation as a whole failed to attain the blessing, right? Because of the extent of the partial hardening, as we'll talk more about. Okay. Now, Paul says in Romans 9, God is not unjust in his actions, right? He talks about how he has mercy and compassion on those he desires. He uses that Moses Pharaoh illustration, right? The hardening of Pharaoh. I don't want to debate tonight whether Pharaoh hardened his heart or God hardened his heart. That's not something I wish to debate all night tonight, which people like to do for hours and hours. But the language about God's hardening of Israel doesn't mean he's completely divorcing their election. Okay, that it doesn't mean that their election's over, right? Because if that's the case, then Paul just said the opposite in Romans 9, 1-5. What I talked about at the beginning, that Paul talks about their position before God. So Paul's able to live in this tension. And there's a lot of tension in Romans 9-11, a lot of tension points. Paul is living in this tension. Okay. Remember, he's trying to wrestle with this whole issue. Like, he's been a Pharisee his whole life. He comes to faith in the Messiah. Now he's dealing with, how do I deal with this issue with Israel has not received their Messiah as a whole. The nation as a whole has not received their Messiah, and a remnant has. And what about how does God do this? Like, how does this work? Did God harden? He hardens them, and then the nations get to believe. And what about the nations? And then what about Israel's future? And all these issues are tension points in Paul's theology, but he's able to hold on to it. He's able to hold on to these tension points. Whereas today in Christian theology, a lot of times we have to figure it out 100%, and we can't live in any kind of tension. We don't like tension. But in the Bible, there's a lot of tension. Okay, there's things that are not completely resolved perfectly. There's paradox. They're able to live in two different things that appear to be saying two different things sometimes. Um, they're able to live with God's foreknowledge in our free will. They're able to live with those things. They don't try to figure them out completely. So just remember that he's able to live in this tension. Okay, he's having to live with this tension. And then he says in Romans 10, he talks about, he prays, he's burdened for his countrymen. He says, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire, my prayer to God on behalf of my fellow Israelites is for their salvation, for I can testify they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not in line with the truth. Some of your translations say not in accordance with knowledge. I'm aware of that, but I like the Net translation because Daniel Wallace has had a lot of input on this translation. He's one of the foremost experts in Greek, so I like this translation. He goes on to say, for ignoring the righteousness that comes from God, seeking instead to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law, with the result that there is righteous to everyone who believes. Okay, so Paul talks about Israel being ignorant here of God's righteousness, seeking to establish their own righteousness. They have a zeal for God. They really do. Okay, they have true, genuine zeal for God. And I've run to Orthodox Jews or Jews who do have a zeal for God. They definitely believe. I'm talking about the Orthodox Jews, not secular Jews. They believe God. Some of them believe certainly God exists, and they believe He's real in their lives, and they're passionate about trying to do the right thing and everything, but there's something missing there, of course. And so Paul talks about this issue once again of the law, the end of the law, and that's been a big debate what that means. So end translated, it's translated various, the way people debate the way that's translated, but I think we need to realize is that when you look at Orthodox Jews, as I was in Israel, a few weeks ago, when I looked out the Western Wall, saw hundreds and hundreds of Orthodox Jews are all over Israel praying fervently, praying every day. It's frustrating for me that obviously I think of Paul, what he's saying here is that just like he said, he's praying for them, for their salvation. He's burdened for them because they have a zeal for God that's not in accordance with the right knowledge, or that's not according to the truth they need to know. So they're missing something. They're missing who is the one that leads them to righteousness. Now, obviously, um, when we traditionally read this verse as Christ at the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, that leads to a lot of debates what that means. Um, some people translate it, as the goal at which the Torah aims as a Messiah, because the law is translated as Torah. That's what that's translated as in Hebrew. Or others translate it as for the Messiah is the end of the Torah, for everyone who has faith may be justified, or the Messiah is the culmination of the Torah, so there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Remember, when you think of the word law, remember, like I said, it's translated as Torah in Hebrew or nomos in Greek, but it means different things in different contexts. Okay, you'd have to read all of Paul's letters to know what he's doing there with the Torah, because in some places it's different. Some people, when they think of the Torah, it means the first 5 books of the Bible, right? It can mean directional teaching or guidance for walking the path of life. It just means teaching at times. Sometimes people hear the word Torah, it means the 613 commandments in the Torah sometimes. But most Christians, I think, view it as like the law of Moses, or the Mosaic law. And they don't have a very positive view of the law, right? They think it's like burdensome, it's legalistic. If you say that to Jews would disagree. They don't view the law as legalistic. Talk about Orthodox Jews today. But Paul certainly, um, I don't think he's saying that the coming of Jesus is completely terminating the entire Torah. Just terminates it, right? So the Torah has zero relevance to our lives today. That would be like saying, well, I don't need to read the Torah anymore. It has no relevance to my life. Okay, we do know there's some passages from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, repeated in the New Testament, right? We have passages like honor your father and mother, don't covet, about lying, some other things. There are some passages that are repeated in the New Testament. It's true the sacrificial system of the Torah has been completely filled in Jesus, and the priest has been completely fulfilled in Jesus. It's true that there's many of the Levitical laws, those some of the sacrifices they would make, all the details have definitely been fulfilled in Jesus, and they're not applicable to today. We can't apply some of those commands of it. They weren't given to us anyway. They're given to Israel. So the whole Torah was given to Israel anyway. That's who it was originally given to. But through the Torah, the purpose of the Torah is to reveal our need for the Messiah. Okay, it's through the Torah we have knowledge of sin, right? We realize that we fall short and we can't keep the Torah. We can't keep the law, right? And so Jesus is the goal for which the Torah points to. Okay, like the Torah is pointing to the Messiah coming. Okay, so the Torah is supposed to show us the need for a Savior. Okay, the need for a Messiah who will atone for sin. Okay, but I don't think you want to read that as the Torah is completely irrelevant. Okay, that wouldn't. Jesus also says, of course, in his own teachings that the Torah has been fulfilled in him. It's been fulfilled. He doesn't say terminated, fulfilled. So at the end goal or purpose or culmination finds that in the person of Jesus. Okay, now it is true that the righteousness, the ultimate righteousness, comes in the Messiah. The Torah could not give us the righteousness that the Messiah gives. And these Jews today who are seeking to establish a righteousness of their own are not going to find it because they don't know their Messiah, right? The only true righteousness they're going to find is in a covenant relationship with God through their Messiah. He brings the righteousness that the Torah can't bring. Okay? So definitely that is true 100%. Now, notice Paul in other passages in his writings Sometimes he says positive things about the Torah. He'll say, like in First Timothy, he says, we know that the Torah, the law, is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and the sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers and immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers, or else contrary to sound teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So he's talking about here the law or the Torah being showing people's sin, right? It's showing the unrighteousness or the lawlessness of people who do these things, right? So in that case, it's a good thing because it's supposed to convict people of their sin. That's why when you talk to somebody today and they don't know what sin is, they don't believe in sin, you can always bring up things from the law or the Torah. I always ask people to say, have you ever broken any of the commandments? Let's talk about them. And I try to allow the Holy Spirit to bring to their conscience how they've broken the law of God. The law is a tutor that leads us to Christ, right? It's supposed to be a tutor that surfaces sin, shows them their shortcomings, right? Paul has other passages where he's very positive about the Torah, the law, right? These verses all have to read in context. Romans says, do we not overthrow the law by the notion of this of faith? By no means. The contrary, we uphold the law. Romans 7:7. What shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Romans 7:12. Thus the law is holy and the commandment is holy and just and good. Then I just read in Romans 9, to the Israelites belong the sonship, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the Torah, the law, the temple, and the promises. Galatians 3, is the law then opposed the promises of God? Certainly not. And then sometimes he has negative things to say about the law, the Torah, right? He says in Galatians, all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. No one is justified before God by the law or the Torah, right? There's neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but new creation is everything. Or Romans 3:20, no human being will be justified in God's sight by the works of the law, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So you have to read all those verses in context and how they fit in the books, right, that Paul's writing to. But the point is that you're never going to be able to come up with one understanding of the law or the Torah off one text alone. You've got to read all Paul's letters in context, who he's writing to, who the audience is, what's going on in those texts and that culture and that cultural context. Okay, so you never ever want to just read one verse out of context. If there, Paul's anti-law, he hates the law, and then though I could point to another passage where he's very pro-law. See, so you got to read the books in context who he's writing to. Okay. Now, so he talks about here Romans 10:1-4. I talks about how, as I said, his prayer to God on behalf of Israel is for their deliverance, and when we talk about deliverance, that's what salvation is. Okay, when we talk about salvation, that means to be rescued or delivered. Okay, that's we talk about we talk about it can be a temporal deliverance where someone needs to be saved in the present right now. It can be future deliverance, right? But Paul definitely he's concerned that Israel will be rescued. They need to be rescued. And then we talk a little bit remember the context of Romans 10. We talk about that prayer. We pray with people. We confess it with your mouth, believe in your heart, you will be saved. Remember that in that passage, Paul is talking about a more of a temporal deliverance. I mean, he's talking about right now they need to be saved. It's not so much speaking of the future eschatological deliverance for people. But sometimes we talk about that verse, faith comes from the hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. So definitely the gospel itself is a report. Paul talks about who has believed our report. He quotes out of Isaiah there, Isaiah 53. People definitely need to receive the report, but people don't always have to hear with their senses the gospel to be saved. What I mean by that is they could read it, reading about the gospel online, reading the Bible, reading it, they could be saved that way, like reading the text, and God could speak to them through the text. I mean, they're hearing the word. I don't mean they're hearing a preacher always preaching it to them. I'm saying they could hear it that way too. So it is true that many people come to faith in Jesus through hearing the gospel presented through someone talking. That's the way I do the majority of my evangelism, and I'm a big believer in that. But I'm also a believer that God can reach people. I leave this on my dad's desk. He's 94 years old. How to have peace with God. I mean, he could read this. He could read it 20 times and he could definitely come to faith that way, right? It's not like he has to hear me telling him, even though he's already heard it before. So God uses all means of communication now to reach people. Definitely with the advent of the internet, there's just so many ways to reach people. All right. So let's try to cover a few things about Romans 11. So he starts out, Paul talks about in Romans 11, he says that God has not rejected Israel. Okay, and then he uses the illustration of his own life. If you read Paul talks about his own life, right? He's an example. He hasn't rejected me. Who are his people in Romans 11:1? Well, given if you read Romans 9:30 through 10:21 and the rest of Romans 11, it always refers to Israel of the nation as a whole, ethnic Israel. Okay. And he says in Romans 11, they have not stumbled as to fall. And then he talks about Romans 11:5-7 of a remnant who believes, right? And then the rest were hardened. The rest of the nation were hardened and a remnant who believes. Just like I talked about back here in my little picture. There's a remnant who believes, right? A remnant. And then the rest are the unbelieving Israel who are partially hardened right now, right? Talks about that hardening. So when Jewish people come to faith today, a Jewish person comes to faith in Jesus, they become part of the remnant who believes, right? They come out of that unbelieving Israel and they become the remnant, part of the remnant. Okay. Paul and the apostles are part of that remnant. And Jews who believe today become part of that remnant too. Okay. So um so I talked about here, he says Israel's not stumbled as to fall, and Israel's failure to receive their Messiah was foreknown by God. It didn't cancel God's purpose or plan, but God definitely knew it was going to happen. If you're asking me, well, why did he allow Israel to reject their Messiah in the majority? You could say that allowed the nations to believe, the door opened to the rest of the nations to believe. That's one argument because Paul talks about that in Romans 11. I don't, for us to completely understand it, read the end of Romans. Paul talks about God's ways are the unfathomable, and he talks about how unfathomable God's plan is and all that stuff, the mystery. So Paul was having a hard time trying to figure this out as well. He talks about Romans 11:28, Israel's beloved for the sake of the forefathers. Paul says in Romans 11 to Gentile believers, that's us, majority of people on this call, I assume, that we have, because Israel there's a hardening right now over Israel, this hardening that Gentiles get to believe, but Gentiles are called to provoke Israel to jealousy. They're not to boast. And Gentiles are supposed to return the blessing to Israel. Like we get to receive the Messiah. We have Israel's Messiah. We return that blessing to them by sharing the good news and provoking them to jealousy. Of course, a lot of Jewish people come to faith through Gentiles. Most Jews that come to faith today come to faith through Gentile Christians. It's just the way it is. It's always been that way. And Gentiles sometimes can provoke Jewish people by knowing more about their scriptures than they do. I've seen it happen in my own life. When I start reading Old Testament passages to Jewish people, and they're like, "Well, how do you know so much about my Bible?" I'm like, "Well, because I read it." And Jesus, was raised on the Jewish scriptures. So was Paul, and it's God's word, so we read it. But then he talks about, of course, the end of towards Romans 11:15 about Israel's belief when they come to faith in the Messiah. This will be like life from the dead. It refers to Israel. Israel coming to faith is bringing worldwide salvation and blessing. The whole world will be blessed. Now, that olive tree metaphor that you read about in Romans 11, this picture. Oops, where's my picture? Oop, I went the wrong way, didn't I? I apologize. There it is. If you read about this olive tree metaphor, this is, I'm trying to use an illustration here, which you read about this in Romans 11. The natural branches here are the unbelieving Jews, and the wild branches. Now, I don't know if you have Romans 11 in front of you, like reading it as I'm talking, or else you study this, but if you haven't, then maybe you will. But he talks about the natural branches of the unbelieving Jews, and then the wild branches were the Gentiles, right? And the olive tree is the collective people of God. So the natural branches are cut off for their unbelief, right? And then the wild branches, who are us believing, the Gentiles, we get grafted in, right? We're grafted in through what Jesus has done for us, right? But Paul also says he's able to graft in the unbelieving Jews. And he talks about they're able to be grafted back in too. So once again, as I said, the natural branches are Israel. Those remaining on the branch are the believing remnant, the Jewish remnant, and those who are cut off are the unbelieving Jews. The ones that are grafted in, the wild branches, are Gentiles, were grafted in because of Israel's unbelief. But God is able to graft the unbelieving Israel, the natural branches, back in. He's able to do that. Paul talks about that. Okay. Now, have you guys ever noticed? I don't know if you've ever read Jeremiah 31 that talks about the new covenant. The phrase new covenant's only mentioned in that verse, but we sometimes read that where it says the time is coming, declares the Lord, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Judah and the house of Israel. Hebrews quotes this verse, the book of Hebrews. So God promises to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, because at that time Israel was divided into the northern and southern kingdoms, right? And God pledges to take these two kingdoms and make one new covenant. The division is going to end. He's going to reunite them as a single people under a new covenant. Now, I don't know if you've noticed in Jeremiah 31, that verse here, you have to read the whole chapter in context. It doesn't mention anything about Gentiles. Nothing. Okay, it just talks about this is about the house of Judah and the house of Israel. Okay, so we're supposed to be new covenant Christians, and we've received the new covenant, and Jesus is all about the new covenant. How do we fit into this if it's not even written to us, which it wasn't? Well, the way it fits in is exactly what Paul talks about in Romans 11 with this olive tree metaphor. He talks about how the Gentiles are grafted in. We're not apart from Israel. We don't replace Israel. We stand with Israel. He also has a similar metaphor of political citizenship in Ephesians 2, where he talks about Gentiles are the fellow heirs with Israel, right? We're fellow heirs. We're all on the same page now because of what Jesus has done for us. But we come alongside Israel. We're joining with the commonwealth of Israel through Jesus, right? We have a citizenship that's been changed. He's using a metaphor here, right? So the way we fit into the new covenant is we're grafted in. That's how we get to fit into those original promises that were given to Israel and Judah here, right? In Jeremiah 31. Pretty cool. So remember that when Paul wrote Romans about 57 CE, most Jews were rejecting Jesus as a Messiah. And so that's why he's talking about the wild branches have been cut off, right? But he also warns, if you read Romans 11, he warns the Gentile believers they must not be prideful, right? He says you better don't run around going, oh, we're saved now, we're the real Israel, and we've been grafted in, and God's done with the Jews. That's not the attitude he wants unbelieving Gentiles or believing Gentiles to have. We need to have a humility and realize we stand with Israel still. We don't become Israel. Okay. We're that one new man that Paul talks about in Ephesians, of Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah. So definitely Paul says that Gentiles and Jews are equal spiritually. We're all the same in Jesus. We're one new man. Paul talks about that. We're both saved through Jesus. Nobody comes to faith. Everyone's in the same sinful state as he talks about Romans 3. We all need to come to faith in the same Messiah. But Paul does say Jews are still Jews and Gentiles are still Gentiles. Okay, that passage in Galatians 3 that people read about, there's neither Jew or Gentile anymore. He's not saying that Jews are not Jews anymore and Gentiles are not Gentiles. If that was the case, then he'd have to say males are no longer males and females are no longer females. That would mean on your job application you just put I'm not a male nor female, even though that's confusing today too with all the gender stuff. But the point is that we're all one in Messiah. That's our core identity. But Gentiles are still Gentiles, Jews are still Jews, Chinese people are still Chinese, Russians are still Russians, Swiss people are still Swiss, Germans are still Germans. Everybody has different ethnicities, and that's fine. But we're all one in Messiah based on what Jesus has done for us. Okay. So we're brought near to Israel and Israel's covenants. We don't become Israel, but we share with Israel. So that's important to remember. I'm going to skip that. Now, when he talks about the fullness of the Gentiles there, there's different views on that. Some think it means when the good news reaches all the Gentile nations, once the gospel is preached to every Gentile person, that's a lot of people, God will lift the blindness from Israel and that partial hardening will end. And God will bring in the end climax, right? That hardening will end. Okay. And then God will deal with Israel in even a futuristic way. But notice he says in Romans 11:11-12, he says, I asked, did they stumble in order they might fall? No, by no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world and their failure mean riches for the Gentiles, how much will fulfillment be? But notice he says it's a mystery. As he says here, he says, lest you be wise in your own sight. I do want you to be unaware of the mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So that is a mystery, as Paul talks about, not something we completely can understand. Okay, then finally, let me mention about all Israel being saved. So at the end of Romans 11:26, he talks about all Israel being saved. Now, in the all the instances of all Israel in the Old Testament refers to historical ethnic Israel. Okay. There's different views on this, what it means by all Israel. By the way, this is what the church is today, the ecclesia. Just want to mention this slide that middle part, we are the ecclesia, Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus, right? We're all one in Messiah. We're that one new man Paul talks about in Ephesians. And then on the outside over there, you have unbelieving Israel and then the unbelieving nations. Those are people who still need the gospel, right? But we are that one new man entity of Jew and Gentile, right? In the middle there. Okay. Now, some people think that all Israel can mean different things. Some people think if you're some sort of replacement theology or supersessionism, I mentioned, you might believe the Gentiles are now Jews now. Then they think that all Israel's is Jews and Gentiles coming to faith in Jesus. I don't think that works exegetically. Some people believe it's a future group of Jews who will come to faith in Jesus in the end times, that there's a future group of Jews who come to believe. Some might say, well, is it every Jew's ever lived? Is it all Israel encompasses every Jew's ever lived? I don't think that works exegetically. Or is it about the Jews who believe now in Jesus? I think for me, probably number 2 is my option. Some agree, some don't agree, but that's what I kind of view that as. I think that Paul's talking about the sequence of events in Romans 11 about the partial hardening, the fullness of the Gentiles. Then he talks about in this way Israel will be saved, that there'll be a national salvation of some kind. How will Israel be saved in the future, whatever this future event is? I think what you'll see is there's some sort of Israel has to be in a position where they need their Messiah, where they call out to their Messiah. We read that in Zechariah 12:10, of course, where it talks about, I'll pour out on my house of David and the habits of Jerusalem spirit of grace and supplication. Look on me, they pierced, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. So you read at the end of Zechariah, this time when Israel is, the nations are coming against Israel. And then Jesus comes and he rescues them and he comes them out of olives. I think that if you see a future group of Jewish people coming to faith, it's some sort of event that triggers that, like a future event that puts them in a corner where they have to call out to their Messiah, where they see that they need their Messiah. Right now, they're not in that position. Okay, could be. Jesus says in Matthew 23, I talked about this a few weeks ago. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." He talks about, I long, he says, "You won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." He says, "You won't see me again until you receive me, until you call out to me." And so there may be some sort of future relationship where Jesus will come when they're ready to receive him and they call out to him. Okay. So it could be the Jewish people are surrounded by their enemies. Um, God intervenes, and of course, he brings his Messiah back. And then, once again, those who receive the Holy Spirit, receive their Messiah, will be saved. Okay. And then the whole end times happens, and Jesus is in Jerusalem, and the whole world is changed, and that's where the end comes. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. I think I've probably gone too long. There's a few things more I could say, but I could just go on and on. There's so much. Um, anyway, so that was a lot of theology we did tonight. Probably one of the more Bible-oriented teachings we've done in a while. We went strict apologetics into Bible theology, and I know you guys hated that. You just want apologetics. But anyway, anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions? I know you've mastered Romans 9 through 11, right? You mastered those chapters, right? That's why scholars still write books on them. They're still debating to this day. They figured it out too. There's a lot of theology there for sure, but there are really important chapters at the top of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. And when you go to Israel like I did, and you just, anywhere you see Jews, you just realize that think of Paul's prayer. He's heartbroken over their rejection. He wants to see them come to faith, so Charlie, is there still a plan for the Jews, and are the Jews saved? I'm not sure what your question is. I just went over that. You talking about, do Jews need to come to faith today in their Messiah? Yeah, that's what I just talked about in Romans 9 through 11. They need the plan for all Jews is the same it was that Paul wrote about in Romans 9 through 11. They all need to come to faith in their Messiah. So yes, God has a plan for them, as he talks about in Romans, as I just discussed. Is that what you're asking me? I don't know if that's what you're asking me. Let me know if I'm answering your question. I'm not sure. Oh, I forgot to hit stop recording.